Copyright really is one of the most unfortunate things when it comes to storytelling and creative works in general. Because copyright hinders the ability for storytellers to adapt existing works, to make spin offs, or sequels, or prequels, or any other sort of a derivative work based on an existing story or characters. So, think of how many different stories there are, all kinds of movies and all those that are based on public domain characters, basically, as it is called in USA. When a work is no longer copyrighted, it goes into the public domain. Think of all of those different works, all the movies and all those, like the Disney movies and all those that are based on public domain characters. Now, you can't do that with Star Wars. No reasonable person would deny the cultural impact that Star Wars has had. And yet, you as a storyteller, as an artist, are not allowed to make your own Star Wars spin-offs, or sequels or prequels, and all those other derivative works. That is very unfortunate. Why put an artificial restriction in place that says that some works can be reused and others cannot? Well, the idea behind copyright is that when an artist creates a work, they get an exclusive right to copy those works and get all the monetary benefit. This way, the artist gets all the money, and that would serve as a sort of encouragement for them to make more works. But unfortunately, that system comes at the cost of freedom for other authors to reuse those works. So, if a copyright system was to be in place, it would only make sense to have such a system if the copyright lasts only a few years. Because then at least it would be arguably beneficial to an extent that an artist can get all the money from a work so that they don't starve, basically. But to then say that the copyright should last 70 years after the author's dead is absurd. What on earth benefits could the author possibly get from a work that is still under copyright after the author has already died? What would they possibly do with that money? There is no reason to have a copyright system which lasts over any number of years after the author's death. That makes no sense. There's no way in that makes sense in any way. There's no justification that can be made for it either. Because if the justification is that the artist needs to put food on their table, well, why would they need food on their table if they're already dead? There is no justification. The closest possible justification someone could try to imagine would be something like that the descendants, the children of the author, should also get money. But what right do those children have to restrict what the people can do with the works of art that the parents of those children made? What right do they have to keep that monopoly existing? That's just silly. Those children should make their own artworks and get money out of those. So even the most remotely reasonable argument is itself already unreasonable. There is no reason to have the copyright system last any years longer than the author's lifespan. That just makes no sense in no world. If the copyright was to last only a few years, at least one could argue that it is somewhat beneficial, in that the author gets all the money, they get an exclusive monopoly on the work, so they can put food on the table that way. But it is unreasonable to have the system in such a way that the copyright lasts forever, basically. Like I just mentioned, you cannot make your own Star Wars spin-offs and retellings and whatever other forms of stories you might come up with. Now, Star Wars specifically is just an example. It doesn't need to be that. But it's just a good example because it's very popular and it's a very recognizable work that has had a big cultural impact. So, try to imagine what would the world be different, how would the world be different if the copyright made sense and it only lasted a few years. At most. In that world, like how there are many derivative works based on ancient public domain stories, there would be multitude and there would be numerous Star Wars retellings and adaptations and sequels and prequels. Everyone could come up with their own prequel. If someone dislikes the prequels or the sequels, they could make their own sequels and prequels. There would be a plethora of different Star Wars content out there. Just imagine that there are so many different works, so many different retellings and adaptations of public domain works. You could have that with Star Wars. There could be so many different Star Wars contents. Now again, I'm using this Star Wars as an example. You can imagine any other story you like. There could be so many different works based on it. There would be so many different spin-offs and origin stories and all kinds of things that people come up with. But all that is taken away. So it is a huge detriment to society for that potential to be taken away. So a good way to think about that would be to imagine that all those different works based on public domain characters and stories, the likes of the Disney movies and all those, now just imagine that all of those were taken away. Imagine that copyright lasted 1,000,000 years even back then. What if there was always a copyright system in place that lasted 1,000,000 years? Then there would be no public domain characters ever. No one could have made those stories. Those well-known movies that people like so much, they wouldn't exist. You would be stuck with the book someone wrote 1,000,000 years ago, and that's all you get. Now, do you think that the world would be better off if those characters that were used in those famous retellings were under copyright? If copyright lasted 1,000,000 years and those famous Disney movies and all those were never made. And again, the Disney movies is just an example. All the works ever made based on public domain characters. Would the world be a better place if copyright always lasted so long? If there was never a public domain to source those characters from? Would the world be a better place without all those retellings? I say no. And for the exact same reason, to restrict what can be done with works like Star Wars, it is also wrong, and the world is a bad place, a worse place for it, for the copyright existing. I'd much rather live in the world where there was no such copyright system which restricted what people can do. There are other reasons to also oppose copyright, for example, because of the very nature of restricting the distribution and copying of works that could be considered very antisocial and wrong in its own way. But that's not what this speech is about. This speech is specifically about the ability for storytellers to adapt existing works and create new ways to tell old stories, which itself is a good thing. People seem to have often this mistaken understanding that stories are only supposed to be original, that only original works should be made. That's the precedent that copyright sets, that only original works are allowed. Quote original, unquote, of course. It's arbitrary what works qualify as original and what doesn't. So, anyway, it's perfectly reasonable and also normal to adapt stories. Humans have been doing that sort of thing for a long time before any copyright system laws were in place. If you think of the ancient world, where people would have had their folk laws and all those sorts of things, setting up a copyright system which restricts those things would be silly. And it's silly the same way even today, because really these sorts of works of art of today, like movies, they are really just a modern equivalent of those sorts of old stories. In any case, retelling existing stories is a natural part of storytelling. It is an integral part of what it means to tell stories. Basically, adapting old works and retelling them in new ways is a perfectly valid way to create art. I say down with copyright. Whether some form of a copyright-like system could exist, I don't necessarily oppose that. But the copyright as the copyright system exists in the world for the most part, that I definitely oppose. Some sort of a system like copyright might be reasonable, but that's not the system we got. So the system we do have, I oppose. And I say you should oppose too, because for the reasons I've mentioned, would you not like to see a bunch of retellings and spin-offs and sequels and prequels of your favorite stories? I certainly would like to see that. I would even like to try some of that myself, to try to create some things like that. But as the copyright system currently exists, you can't make your own damn Star Wars fan film without getting in legal trouble. What a joke.